Hello, listeners. So I know a lot of the fans of this channel are wondering where I've gone. I ended about a week ago promising a series on the alt-right, and indeed, most of the spare time I've had for this channel has been going into making that rather long YouTube response series. I imagine I'll start releasing the videos sometime next week. But in the meanwhile, just to put some content on this channel, I decided to very uncharacteristically do a reaction video and really address a common progressive point inside of that reaction video. And the article, in fact, that I'm reacting to is something that I saw on my in real life Facebook feed, posted at least 2 or 3 times by some of my progressive friends. This is this incredibly clickbaity article by Business Insider, broadly about political correctness, and the title is "Millennials Want Everyone to Know These 5 Things About Political Correctness, Which Older Generations Don't Understand." Okay. So I don't usually respond to clickbait, but bear with me because I think there's something that can be understood by reading through this. Because regardless of the fact that this is the purest BuzzFeed style trash, it does outline an attitude that's very common even among very intellectual and very intelligent progressive people. And I know a lot of people who I know on the conservative side, they come from communities that don't have a lot of progressives. Oftentimes they think that complaining about political correctness essentially has no answer, since very few progressives will argue it, online and even sometimes in real life. But I think this article demonstrates that that's not because they don't have answers for it. In fact, they do. Again, progressivism isn't stupid. It's believed by very intelligent people, and despite the fact that this article is incredibly clickbaity, it sort of gets to the bottom of what their explanation of political correctness might be. I'm just going to read through these 5 reasons briefly so we can get some of the flavor. I don't think I'm going to read all of the article, but the first reason why millennials have it right about political correctness is there's a major difference between being honest, quote unquote, and spewing prejudice. Notice here the spewing prejudice isn't under scare quotes, but the being honest is. You have a right to share your opinion, but you don't have the right to make people feel threatened. Using emotionally charged words that make others feel frightened for their mental, physical, and emotional well-being, even if it does not impact you in the same way, is morally wrong. Number 2, political correctness is not about censorship, it's about showing respect. Censorship is a coercive attempt to hide something from people. Asking people to use more inclusive language is not silencing their voice, it's inviting them to use language in a way that promotes productive conversation. The purpose of political correctness is to treat all people with the love and respect they deserve. Number 3, millennials feel more connected to global citizenship and human rights than nationalism. Not only do millennials have conversations with people around the world, they are also seeing inhumane acts of violence against marginalized people live streamed on social media. This increased visibility and exposure leads to a desire to ensure equality for all individuals, regardless of their race, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status, or religion. Number 4, inclusive language creates a space for meaningful conversations to take place. Offensive language makes people feel unsafe. If you are trying to have a difficult conversation with somebody and they open the discussion using words that were aimed at hurting your feelings, making you feel unsafe or undermining your personhood, would you want to keep talking? No, and that's why everyone should use more inclusive language. And finally, here we get to the last reason. 5, millennials are not being sensitive, they're just being morally minded and ethically informed global citizens. I don't even know if I really need to read this last one. It's basically just a repeat of the other 4 points. And of course, I read this in sort of a silly voice, but once we get past the clickbaity title and the rather overwrought language, I don't think that the argument here is entirely unserious. Which is to say that if I went up to one of my progressive friends, or any of the 3 progressive friends who I saw post this very article, I don't think they would back away from these claims. They posted this because they agreed with it in some form. It's a little bit silly the way it's phrased. It's a little bit self-congratulatory towards millennials, which are somehow grouped into the progressive stack as another identity group that's to be defended against attacks from conservatives. But at any rate, I think, the arguments would more or less be the same. And, despite the fact that there are 5 points here, there were really only 2 points. The first and the main point was that political correctness, or the kinds of requirements that progressives put on language, aren't about any type of control or censorship, but are about being polite, being courteous, not being an asshole. And really the second point in this article is that not being an asshole or being polite is very conducive to having a productive conversation. And indeed, you would get more or less the same two reasons if you asked any intelligent progressive. And to be honest, there's a lot of truth about that response. Indeed, a lot of the things that progressives are asking for are, in some ways, requests for additional politeness, for sensitivity towards feelings. And of course, we should all be sensitive towards people's feelings. That's how you have productive conversations to begin with. Now, of course, people on the conservative or cultural libertarian side have a really good comeback to this, and it usually works really great in disarming the explanation of political correctness as being just politeness, another word for politeness. And that counter-critique against political correctness is that political correctness is not a neutral requirement for politeness. It is in fact something that has 10,000 caveats, a million different super requirements for politeness towards people in certain groups, specifically certain demographic groups that tend to vote and politically support progressive causes, and almost no politeness requirements when it comes to confronting demographic groups that tend not to politically support progressive causes. This is usually explained by progressives in terms of respecting the damages of privilege, right? We have to be more polite to sort of account for the fact that these are less privileged groups. But if you look at political correctness long enough, you'll see quite clearly that the contours of how these standards are applied don't fit nicely into any notion of who's advantaged or disadvantaged in modern society. If you're a poor white Southerner who's suffering from alcoholism and a learning disability, progressives will feel no need to apply this sort of universal courtesy of political correctness to your group or to really anything you say. Moreover, despite the fact that when these progressive and politically correct terms for a language are justified, they're usually justified in terms of having a difficult conversation, we all know that these language requirements, these restrictions, these taboos are frequently used to shut out conservative and traditionalist voices inside of a conversation, and progressives really have no interest in any kind of two-sided dialogue between themselves and really anybody who is anti-progressive. And that's not even getting into the fact that in many cases, these standards of political correctness aren't really social mores, they're enforced with the hard edge of many institutions, either through the threat of firing or actual legal injunction in many countries. But alright, and I would have told you this 2 years ago. Perhaps people have already heard this from people like Sargon of Akkad and Noel Plum. I think the response to political correctness is just politeness is a common one. So why did I make this video? Well, I think that in understanding the phenomenon of political correctness, we can't just stop here. We can't just stop at, it's a double standard, political correctness bad. Obvious double standard means we get rid of political correctness. I mean, political correctness as a proposition for the left, as a means of controlling dialogue, has worked for them quite well. And I think it's very, very important to understand why it's worked so well. This isn't just a common double standard. This isn't just a common argumentative fallacy that can be dismissed by it's not fair or progressives are hypocrites. We need to go a little bit further. And here, I really want to bring in an additional source. Now, in most of these quick takes and in most of my videos on this channel, the ideas have really been my own. I'm sure they came from other sources, but in sort of the process of getting jumbled up in my own internal monologue, these were thoroughly digested. And when I spoke the ideas into the microphone, they were more or less how I visualize them in my mind. But in this particular talk, I'm just going to be totally cribbing from another thinker. So at this point, I'm going to put a big citation out for Mencius Moldbug, who I think really got to the bottom of this concept of political correctness and this concept of progressive control and progressive interest in preserving politeness and courtesy on their own terms. But given the citation and permission of the audience to essentially use this writer's examples, I think we can go a little further in understanding why political correctness and the call for a controlled courtesy works. So I'm going to start with the very common phrase. I've heard this many times before, and I've heard it from a lot of very clever thinkers, and they'll say something like, civilization started when the first insult was hurled at another person. And, it's very basic and very clever, but I think the main idea of this saying, civilization started when the first insult was hurled, was that human societies always revolve around power, might makes right, but it wasn't really civilization until people had to regulate what you could say, what you couldn't say, develop cultures, develop customs, develop a sense of propriety, and come up with social pecking orders that express this. And I think there's a large amount of truth there. To a large degree, civilization is based around a cultural expectation, a cultural norm, a cultural sense of propriety about what you can make fun of, what you can't make fun of, what is sacred, what is profane. Because the thing is that humans are social creatures, and because they're social creatures, there are very few things they hate more than being made fun of, than being insulted, than being disrespected verbally. They hate people being mean to them. They hate people putting them down. They hate people being rude. And that's all the more ironic because in addition to humans really hating being insulted, one of the greatest human pleasures and certainly the best way to feel powerful is to insult and be rude to another person. And so there's always this kind of clash of interests. And inside close bonds of family and friends, the usual rule is that we shouldn't be assholes to each other. We shouldn't be rude to each other. It hurts to get insulted, and you shouldn't do that at the people you like. And of course, when we come into larger social organizations, I think there's a temptation to always imagine a perfect society where nobody is an asshole. A community not just of close family and friends who aren't assholes to each other, but where being an asshole is universally never practiced. We have an instinct that says people shouldn't be assholes or rude to each other, and we should always be polite. But here comes the other really big problem. And that is that civilization, in addition to being the thing that sort of sets the rules of society and the standards of propriety for a group of people, cannot, as a matter of course, explicitly legalize or use the force of the state or army to illegalize rude behavior, to illegalize callous behavior, to respond to insults with physical force anywhere and everywhere they're said. The legal apparatus can keep order when it comes to physical force, but once it starts going after people for every single insult or lack of courtesy, the state will collapse. And this has been a rule of societies for as long as societies and civilizations have existed. And just to go back to the source material for this, Mencius Moldbug brings up a adage of early Roman law, which in Latin is de minimis non curat lex, or in translation, the law does not concern itself with trifles. It shouldn't be illegal to be an asshole, but more importantly, it just can't. And this just really stings people, because we want deep in our primate souls a society where people can't be assholes, even though we know it's not achievable. It's never happened in human history. But of course, when I say that, I have to introduce one enormous caveat, and that is that enforcing rules against impoliteness is entirely possible if you only enforce those rules of propriety when it comes to a select class of elite individuals or a select demographic caste. To make it illegal to be an asshole against a member of the elite or ruling class or the upper caste itself. And indeed, this works well as an enforcement of a certain type of power for two reasons. The first one is that it cuts off the main ways of communicating and organizing dissatisfaction with the existing authority. But the second reason why this is such an effective way to preserve power is that there's sort of a psychological consilience in the human mind. Deep down in our primate brains, we all want to be in a society where it's illegal to be an asshole. Our primate brains want it that way. And so when you're taking somebody out and punishing them for challenging you and putting down your authority, you don't say, I'm punishing this person for questioning authority. You say, we're punishing this person for being an asshole. And everybody's subconscious will secretly agree with you. It's very effective that way. And to give you an example, I'll quote straight from Moldbug. In old Japan, it wasn't illegal to be an asshole. It wasn't even illegal to be an asshole to a samurai, but it was certainly illegal to be an asshole to a samurai if you were to samurai. See how that works? You might say the samurai were a sort of protected class, a system not unique to old Japan. Always and everywhere, microaggressing against the protected class is hazardous to your health. And here I will add, hazardous to your health in a very real and legal and state-enforced way. And here we can see the modern politically correct way of dealing with microaggressions and identifying political correctness as just courtesy has a very, very strange historical analog. Requiring courtesy towards protected classes is an incredibly common feature of old-fashioned hierarchical and feudal systems. So common that it even has a name in Latin. As Mencius Moldbug points out, that name, in Latin, is private law. Privilege, the first and most common private law that all protected classes reserve for themselves, is the law that protects them from insult and slander. And I know the irony of this terminology is dripping. But unfortunately, the historical analogy ends there, because regardless of the fact that the left organizes itself in terms of protected classes, regardless of the fact that they reserve as rules of political correctness very much the same kind of privileges typically reserved for ruling classes, a modern critic of progressivism like myself or Mencius Moldbug or Sargon of Akkad can't get around the fact that the rights reserved by political correctness and protected groups in general are not held by any type of ruling class, but rather many demographics that are out of power, many demographics that could be considered underclasses. This is not something that the white and Jewish progressive elites ever use for themselves. So I guess a listener might ask, where does that leave us? How does any of this historical digression actually get us any closer to understanding what political correctness is and how it's being used by progressives? Well, to answer that question, I think I'm going to have to depart from Moldbug and pick up a little bit of my own speculation on this question. And my own reading on the situation is just this, that all of the various protections of courtesy and privilege that are advocated for on behalf of these protected groups aren't really about protections for these disadvantaged groups. They're about preserving the privilege of white and Jewish progressives. They are about shoring up the cosmopolitan progressives' own grip on political power and stamping out avenues in which they can be challenged. And I think it's a little bit hard to see this immediately, but it's really the function of two historical forces. The first one being the fact that the West and later America has been so dominant on the world stage for so long that many of the different political groups operating within it see their only rivals, their only potential opponents as other people inside a Western context, as other political and ideological groups inside Western society, inside Western civilization. That combined with progressive political parties' uncanny ability to hold sway over minority populations living inside of Western societies has really led to a strange situation where cosmopolitan progressives can obtain protected status and privilege by proxy, because there was no way that Western society was going to develop rules of decorum designed at protecting the feelings of rich, well-to-do, elite, progressive white people. The egalitarian nature of the progressive movement itself, along with the Christian nature of Western civilization, just would not have allowed that to take place. However, the progressive as the avatar of some group's interests, be they African Americans or poor refugees or new immigrants, can in essence get all the same protections, can get all the same deference inside of a political conversation. Inside even social engagements, insofar as the conversation ranges onto culture and politics, which is really all cosmopolitan progressives ever needed or wanted. The ability to put down their opponents and gain status over their rivals, and the only context that really has mattered for the last 100 years. And this is certainly true to my own experience with political correctness. Now, I attempt to be courteous as much as I can, considering I think it's a good thing generally, but I have a very irreverent, politically incorrect attitude. And I live in a very diverse community, both racially and culturally. But without fail, of the many times that people have been trying to enforce these politically correct standards of decorum, It's always been in conversation with a white progressive, and the decorum that's asked for is always requested in absentia from some other party who's not in the conversation. And as such, this operates as a sort of protection by proxy. The cosmopolitan progressive can claim privilege without owning it. Now, somebody might ask me, okay, so has this been done before in history? I mean, progressives are good at a lot of things, but given the prevalence of these protected groups, given how there have always been these standards of selectively enforced decorum, certainly some other elite must have thought of this strategy. And I'm not so sure actually that this isn't unique in history, because I think in other points in history, this is an incredibly dangerous tactic to take. Certainly, elites can claim privileges to protect some kind of sacred object or some kind of ancestral memory. That's very common. But when the totem is itself another group of people with their own political interests, this opens up a whole can of worms. Because that political interest group can essentially make any claim it wants to on the elites that are using them as a totem, that are trying to benefit from their own protected status. And those same elites have really nothing to say against them. Now, if those elites have an utter monopoly on power, and they have total political sway in the subject group's population, they might not have anything to worry about, and indeed, a lot of people, a lot of progressives, a lot of Democrats have had nothing to worry about in the past. But as you see, as this political correctness stuff has become more prominent, you see even our current crop of cosmopolitan progressives succumbing to the natural consequence of using this strategy, succumbing to the natural problem, and the natural reason why this same tactic hasn't been used in the past. The subject groups that are being used to justify the elite's own set of privileges and protections starts making unreasonable demands because they know they can get away with it. And there's many examples of this, of the left eating itself, of these groups putting demands upon progressives that progressives really don't want to honor. But I think there's pretty much no better contemporary example than the uprising that we saw in Evergreen State College. I mean, Evergreen was pretty much a college where a bunch of white and Jewish progressive professors got together and claimed their own political privilege to speak based on their ability to speak for subject minority populations. And this year, this spring, the bill for that finally came due. And that bill will continue to come due, if my model of the situation is correct, if indeed this is what's going on. And I think this probably is going to be one of the most phenomenal downfalls of progressivism. I talk a lot about how unassailable progressivism is in institutions, but this is the thread that will finally lead to its own undoing. Because the elites can give in to the demands this year, they can give in to the demands next year. Evergreen College can make whatever concessions it needs to satisfy its own minority students, to compromise its own initial set of principles. But eventually, the demands will increase to the point where the elite have no ability to actually fulfill them, to actually make good on their own promises. And at that moment, the coalition will collapse. The justifications for cosmopolitan progressive rule, and also their place in the contemporary institutions of teaching and learning, will be wiped away in an instant. And this is no small event. It's probably very, very far away from happening. But it is at some point coming. And I myself am not really sure what's going to happen at that point. I'm not so sure anyone does. But I think that with that statement, we can look at political correctness as what it actually is. Political correctness is power, it's protection, it's privilege, but it is not politeness. It is not a universal concept of courtesy. But in saying that, despite the probably more interesting explanation, I'm probably not telling anti-progressives, liberals, or conservatives anything they don't already know. But in the off chance that somebody on the progressive side of the aisle is listening to this talk, I would like to call on them to be honest and to admit that political correctness is not about courtesy. Not for my sake, not for the sake of conservatives, not for the sake of being fair, but for your own sake, for the long-term sake of the future you want to see. Because while this tree might be bearing fruit in the present, if you continue to eat from it, it will eventually consume you. But of course, that being said, it's very unlikely anyone who needs to hear it will listen. At any rate, have a wonderful night, and I hope to be back with the remainder of the series I promised.